I never imagined that the person who slept in the next room to mine throughout my childhood would be the same one who would try to destroy my marriage out of pure envy and malice. My name is Daniel Carter. I'm 38 years old, a civil engineer in Portland, Oregon, and this is the story of how I discovered that my own brother had been sabotaging my marriage for over 2 years. When you grow up believing that blood is more important than anything, when you defend your brother in every fight at school, when you lend him money without hesitation, you never expect that same person to be working behind the scenes to ruin your happiness. But that's exactly what happened, and what I discovered was so disturbing that it completely changed my view on family and loyalty. Before continuing, subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. I promise this story will show you just how far envy can take someone, and how revenge, when well planned, can be devastatingly perfect. It all started on an ordinary Thursday in March, when my wife Jessica was in the shower and her cell phone wouldn't stop vibrating on our bedroom dresser. Normally, I would never look at her phone. Our relationship has always been based on complete trust, but something in that moment made me look at the screen. They were messages from an unnamed number, and the preview that appeared on the locked screen said something like, "You need to end this before he finds out everything." My heart raced immediately. My mind started racing with possibilities I didn't want to consider. Was Jessica having an affair? Was my wife of 7 years, the woman I planned to have children with, cheating on me? I stood there, holding that phone like it was a bomb about to explode in my hand. When Jessica emerged from the bathroom wrapped in a towel, her hair dripping wet onto the rug we'd bought together on our trip to Seattle, I simply handed her the phone without saying anything. I wanted to see her reaction before accusing her of anything. What I saw on her face wasn't guilt, it was genuine confusion, followed by something that looked like fear. She took the phone, unlocked it, and read the messages, and then her face went completely pale. "Daniel, we need to talk," she said in a voice I'd never heard before, a mixture of anger and something that sounded like defeat. She sat on the edge of the bed, still wet from the shower, and began scrolling through the conversation, showing me months of messages I had no idea existed. The unknown number belonged to my brother, Marcus. My younger brother, 35 years old, who worked as a sales manager at a car dealership in Beaverton, the same guy I helped pay for college when our parents didn't have enough money. The messages were disturbing in a way I never imagined possible. They weren't romantic or sexual messages, they were something much worse. Marcus was systematically planting doubts in Jessica's mind about me. He would send messages saying he saw me having lunch with a woman from work, implying it was something more. He said I had told him I was unhappy in my marriage. He made up stories about me saying I regretted getting married so young. Jessica explained that at first she simply ignored the messages, thinking Marcus was being dramatic or misinterpreting situations. But he was persistent, sending messages almost daily for the past 6 months. He always chose moments when he knew I was traveling for work or when we had had some silly couples argument. Marcus had perfect timing, as if he were studying our routine, waiting for moments of vulnerability to attack. She showed me messages where he said things like, "Your husband doesn't deserve you, Jessica. He's always been selfish since he was a child," or "Have you noticed how he never includes you in important life decisions?" These were elaborate lies, mixed with distorted half-truths that made the narrative seem credible. What completely shocked me was realizing that some of our recent arguments had been directly influenced by the seeds of discord Marcus had been planting. 3 weeks ago, Jessica had been furious with me because I supposedly told Marcus that I thought she was too controlling with finances. I never said that. I would never have thought that, because Jessica is amazing with money, and thanks to her, we managed to save almost $80,000 for the down payment on our house. But Marcus made up this story and presented it to her in the form of brotherly concern, saying he was upset that I was talking badly about her behind her back. Jessica had swallowed that and held a grudge for weeks before finally exploding at me in an argument over nothing. I felt my world crumble as I read those messages. It wasn't a romantic betrayal, it was something far more calculated and cruel. Marcus was deliberately trying to destroy my marriage from within, like a termite devouring the structure of a house until it collapses. But why? That was the question hammering in my head. What had I done to deserve this? I'd always been a good brother. When he lost his job in 2019, I paid his rent for 4 months until he got back on his feet. When he crashed his car drunk and our parents were furious, I defended him and even lent him $3,000 for the repairs. What kind of resentment was festering inside him to do something so destructive? Jessica was crying at that moment, not from sadness, but from anger. She said she had started responding to his messages about 2 weeks ago, not because she believed everything, but because she wanted to understand what was happening. She pretended to agree with some of the things he said to see how far he would go. And Marcus went too far. In his most recent messages, he was suggesting that she deserved someone better, someone who truly valued her. He was planting the idea of divorce in her head, saying that she was too young, too beautiful, and too intelligent to be stuck in a marriage that clearly didn't make her happy, according to his distorted narrative. What made me feel a hatred I had never experienced before was a specific message Jessica showed me. Marcus had written, "Look, Jess, I hate seeing you like this. Daniel has always been the golden child, always gotten everything easily. He doesn't know what it's like to really fight. You deserve someone who sees you as a priority, not as a trophy. If you need support when you decide to leave this, I'll be here for you." He was offering emotional support to my own wife to leave the marriage he was actively sabotaging. It was brilliant in a psychopathic way. He positioned himself as the concerned friend, the shoulder to cry on while setting my marriage on fire. I needed to leave the house at that moment. Not because I was angry with Jessica, but because if I stayed in that room another minute, I was going to drive to Marcus's house and do something that would land me in jail. I drove aimlessly for almost an hour through the streets of Portland, past the Burnside Bridge, past Tom McCall Waterfront Park, places where Marcus and I used to skateboard as teenagers, happy memories that now seemed tainted by this horrible revelation. How could I not have noticed? What other signs did I miss? How many times did he sit at my dinner table, eat the food Jessica cooked, and then go home to plan the next step in his campaign of destruction? When I returned home 3 hours later, calmer but equally furious, Jessica was in the living room with her laptop open and a determined look on her face. She had printed out all the conversations with Marcus, organized chronologically, more than 50 pages of documented manipulation. She had also created a timeline connecting his messages with our discussions, irrefutably proving a direct correlation. My wife, who works as a data analyst for a tech company, had turned my brother's betrayal into a case built on concrete evidence. She looked at me and said something that would define everything that followed. "We're not just going to confront him, Daniel. We're going to destroy his pathetic little life the same way he tried to destroy ours." That night, we didn't sleep. We stayed up until 4 in the morning, drinking coffee and planning. Jessica had a theory. Marcus wasn't doing this just out of envy or resentment. There had to be something more, a concrete objective. People don't invest 2 years in elaborate sabotage just out of gratuitous malice. She began to investigate, using her analytical skills to look for patterns, and that's when we found the first worrying clue. For the past 6 months, Marcus had been liking and commenting on Jessica's old Instagram photos, things from before we got married. He was creating a narrative, constructing a story where he had always been close to her, always cared. The scariest part was when Jessica checked her phone's location settings and discovered that Marcus somehow had access to her real-time location. He probably installed some app when he borrowed her phone months ago, saying his was out of battery and he needed to make an important call. He was tracking my wife. He knew when she was alone, when I was traveling, when we were together. This level of premeditation and invasion of privacy turned the situation from horrible to absolutely terrifying. My brother wasn't just an opportunistic saboteur, he was a calculating stalker, and we realized we were dealing with something far more dangerous than we had imagined. The following morning, a Friday, I called in sick to work and said I couldn't come in. Jessica did the same. We needed time to process everything, and more importantly, to investigate thoroughly before taking any rash action. The first thing we did was hire a digital security technician Jessica knew from work, a guy named Trevor who freelanced in cybersecurity. We paid him $300 in cash to come to our house and do a complete scan of all our devices. What Trevor found was even worse than we imagined. Marcus had installed not only a location tracker on Jessica's cell phone, but also keylogger software that recorded everything she typed, including passwords and private conversations. Trevor explained that this type of spyware is usually sold as a parental control tool or for spouses to suspect infidelity, but that it was completely illegal to install it on someone's device without consent. Marcus had access to virtually all of Jessica's digital life: emails, messages, social media, even the conversations from the online therapy app she used to deal with anxiety. My brother knew exactly what was going on in my wife's head, her fears, her insecurities, and he used that information to manipulate her surgically. It was such a profound violation that Jessica had to run to the bathroom and vomit when Trevor explained the extent of the intrusion. I held her hair while she cried over the toilet, feeling such intense anger that my hands trembled. Trevor removed all the malware and installed additional protections, but he also gave us valuable advice. Don't let Marcus know you've discovered it yet. If he realizes his access has been cut off, he might panic and do something drastic. You need time to build a full case before acting. He was right. We needed to understand Marcus's full motivation, find out if there were other victims, and most importantly, ensure that when we finally confronted him, he wouldn't be able to evade or minimize what he did. Trevor also suggested we document everything and consider involving the police. Since stalking and unauthorized access to devices were crimes in Oregon, punishable by up to 1 year in prison and fines of up to $6,250. After Trevor left, Jessica and I sat in the kitchen and began to put together an investigation plan. We decided that she would continue responding to Marcus's messages normally, as if nothing had changed. But now each conversation would be carefully documented and archived. Meanwhile, I would discreetly begin investigating my brother's personal life, looking for motivations, financial problems, personal issues, anything that would explain why he chose to destroy me in this way. I also decided to talk to my cousin Rachel, who had always been close to Marcus and worked as a bartender in the same neighborhood where he lived. If anyone knew his secrets, it was her. I ran into Rachel that same night at the bar where she worked, a place called Paddy's Pub in northwest Portland, an Irish establishment that served the best fish and chips in town. I ordered a Guinness and waited until it thinned out before pulling her aside for a chat. Rachel always had a sixth sense for family drama, so when I said I needed to know if Marcus had said anything strange about me or Jessica recently, she immediately became defensive. "Why are you asking that, Danny? What happened?" Her voice had that tone of someone who already knew something was wrong but didn't want to be the one to confirm it. I decided to be direct. "Rachel, I need you to be honest with me. Is Marcus acting strangely about my marriage?" What Rachel told me over the next 2 hours while she cleaned glasses and attended to occasional customers, painted a disturbing picture of my brother. According to her, Marcus had developed an unhealthy obsession with Jessica over the past 2 years, ever since they met at a 4th of July barbecue at our parents' house. Rachel said Marcus had drunk too much that day and confided in her that he had always thought Jessica was amazing, that he never understood how someone like me had managed to get a woman so far out of my league. At the time, Rachel thought it was just the alcohol talking, but after that Marcus began mentioning Jessica with worrying frequency, always with comments about how I didn't value her enough, or how she deserved someone more successful. Rachel also revealed something that made me feel like I'd been punched in the gut. Marcus had mentioned to her about 6 months ago that he was considering telling Jessica about an alleged betrayal on my part, except that this betrayal never happened. It was completely fabricated. He had told Rachel that he saw me at a hotel in Seattle with a woman, but Rachel knew I was at an engineering conference that week and doubted the story. She had even confronted Marcus about it, saying that spreading rumors could destroy a family, but he insisted he was only concerned about Jessica's well-being. Now it all made sense. He was testing narratives with Rachel, seeing which stories were believable before using them with Jessica. But what Rachel told me next was the missing piece of the puzzle. Marcus had serious financial problems. He owed over $40,000 in credit card debt, had a car loan that was 3 months overdue, and had gambled and lost a significant amount on an online sports betting site. He was desperate for money and had mentioned to Rachel that if Jessica divorced me, he could be there to comfort her, and eventually, in his words, she could help him get out of his financial hole. His strategy was absolutely sick. Destroy my marriage, position himself as the shoulder to cry on, develop some kind of relationship with my wife, and then use her financial situation to solve his own problems. I left that bar feeling a mixture of nausea and clarity. Marcus wasn't just an envious brother. He was a financial predator, willing to destroy my family to solve his own money problems. And the scariest part was that he had spent 2 years executing this plan methodically, as if it were a professional project. The more I thought about it, the more disturbing details came to light. I remembered how he always suggested Jessica should ask for a raise at work, how he excessively praised her financial independence, how he subtly implied that I was a dead weight who didn't contribute enough to the couple, even though I earned $95,000 a year as a civil engineer. When I got home, it was almost midnight, and I found Jessica still awake, surrounded by papers and with her laptop open. She had discovered something too. Using her digital investigation skills, she had managed to access the metadata of some photos Marcus had sent her over the months, photos that supposedly showed me in compromising situations. What she discovered was that these photos were digitally manipulated. Marcus had used editing apps to insert my face into other people's photos, creating false evidence of infidelity. One of the photos he sent, supposedly showing me hugging an unknown woman in front of a restaurant in Beaverton, was actually a photo of a completely different guy, but Marcus had edited it to look like my face. Jessica had even found the original images through a reverse Google search. The level of premeditation was absurd. He wasn't just planting doubts with words, he was creating false physical evidence to support his lies. This transformed the situation from psychological manipulation into something bordering on fraud and falsification of evidence. I told Jessica everything Rachel had revealed about Marcus's financial motivations, and I saw her expression change from hurt to something harder, more calculated. She looked at me and said, "So he wants money? He wants to destroy our lives for money? We're going to give him exactly what he deserves, and it won't be a single cent. It will be the complete destruction of his reputation." We spent the entire weekend locked in the house, planning every detail of our revenge. Jessica, with her analytical mind, created a Google Doc she called Project Marcus Collapse, a name that made me smile for the first time in days. The plan had several phases, each designed to expose Marcus and make him pay not only legally, but socially, professionally, and emotionally. The first phase was to continue gathering evidence for another 2 weeks, letting him think the plan was working. Jessica would continue responding to his messages, even pretending she was seriously considering separating from me. This would give him time to compromise even further, perhaps confessing his true feelings or intentions. The second phase involved presenting the situation to our family in a way that left no room for Marcus to play the victim or distort the narrative. Jessica suggested we organize a family dinner like Thanksgiving, but in April, inviting our parents, my older sister Patricia, who lived in Eugene, and Rachel herself. During that dinner, we would present all the evidence at once, like a prosecutor presenting a case to a jury. It wouldn't be an emotional and chaotic discussion. It would be a systematic and irrefutable exposition of the truth. Marcus would be confronted in front of everyone who mattered, with no chance to manipulate the situation or play us against each other. The third phase was the legal one. We had already begun consulting with a lawyer specializing in cybercrimes and stalking, a guy named Richard Brennan, who had an office in downtown Portland and charged $350 an hour. Richard had reviewed the preliminary evidence and confirmed that we had a solid basis to criminally prosecute Marcus for unauthorized access to electronic devices, stalking, and possibly even extortion, since his intention to eventually financially benefit from the situation could fall into that category. Potential penalties included jail time, heavy fines, and a permanent restraining order. Richard also mentioned that we could sue Marcus civilly for intentional emotional distress, which could result in significant compensatory and punitive damages. The fourth, and perhaps most satisfying phase of our plan, was the professional and social destruction of Marcus. Jessica had connections in the Portland tech community and suggested that we could discreetly inform future employers about his cyberstalking activities, as this would be relevant information for any company considering hiring him. We also planned to inform the dealership where he worked about his illegal activities, since crimes involving technology and privacy violations usually resulted in immediate dismissal in companies that handled sensitive customer information. We also considered exposing the situation on social media in a controlled manner, not as dramatic revenge, but as a public warning about predatory behavior. As we planned, I felt a strange mix of sadness and determination. Part of me still couldn't believe it had come to this with my own brother, someone I'd shared a room with for 15 years, someone I'd learned to ride a bike with, someone I'd spent every Christmas with. But that nostalgia was quickly replaced by the memory of the 50 pages of manipulated papers, the falsified photos, the spyware, the complete violation of my wife's privacy. Marcus had made a conscious and sustained choice to destroy us, and now he would have to face the consequences of that choice. There would be no mercy, no second chance. Some betrayals are too deep for forgiveness. The following Monday, I returned to work trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy. But every interaction felt superficial compared to the drama unfolding behind the scenes of my life. My boss, a guy named Tom Henderson, noticed I was distracted during our weekly project meeting and asked if everything was all right at home. I simply smiled and said I was dealing with some family issues, nothing serious. If he had known that family issues meant systematically documenting my brother's attempt to destroy my marriage in order to eventually steal my wife and her money, he probably would have given me the rest of the week off. But I needed to keep up appearances, because part of our plan depended on Marcus not suspecting a thing until the right moment. Jessica was executing her part of the plan with a coldness I didn't know she possessed. During that week, she intensified her responses to Marcus, sending messages that suggested she was seriously considering leaving the marriage. She wrote things like, "You're right. I deserve better," or, "Sometimes I look at Daniel and wonder if we made the right choice so young." Each message was carefully crafted to seem authentic, but vague enough not to be legally binding. Marcus took the bait completely. His responses became bolder, more intimate. He started calling her during the day, whenever he knew I was at work. Conversations that Jessica recorded with an app our digital security consultant had installed. In one of those calls, which I listened to Wednesday night with Jessica sitting next to me on the couch, Marcus finally revealed his true intentions explicitly. He told Jessica that he had always had feelings for her from the first moment he met her 7 years ago on my 31st birthday. He confessed that he was devastated when we announced our engagement, that he spent months trying to find something wrong with me, to feel better about the situation. And then, 2 years ago, he decided that if he couldn't have Jessica naturally, he would create the circumstances for it to happen. His exact words were, "Jessica, I know it sounds crazy, but I've spent 2 years freeing you from a situation that kept you trapped. Daniel is my brother, but you deserve someone who sees you the way I see you." Hearing those words in my own brother's voice, spoken with such sick candor, was like being repeatedly stabbed. Jessica gripped my hand tightly as the recording continued, and I could feel her trembling with pent-up rage. Marcus stayed on the line, saying that as soon as she made the decision to separate, he would be there to help with absolutely everything she needed. Financial, emotional, legal, everything. He even mentioned knowing a divorce lawyer in Portland who could ensure she received more than half of our assets, since Oregon was an equitable marital property state. He was literally planning how to financially dissect our marriage while pretending to be the concerned guy who only wanted what was best for her. Jessica, maintaining the composure of a professional actress, responded non-committently, saying she needed time to think about everything, but that she appreciated him being there for her. When the call ended, she turned off the recorder and simply began to cry silently. They weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure anger and frustration at having to feign empathy with someone who was actively trying to destroy her life. I hugged her and promised that in less than 2 weeks, Marcus would be paying for every lie, every manipulation, every moment of suffering he caused. We now had audio evidence of his confession, admitting premeditation, admitting that he had spent 2 years deliberately sabotaging our relationship. It was pure gold. Richard Brennan, our attorney, nearly jumped out of his chair when he heard the recording that Friday. He was in his office on the 12th floor of a commercial building on Southwest Broadway, overlooking downtown Portland, when we played the audio. "This is exactly what we needed," he said, adjusting his glasses and furiously making notes in his yellow legal notepad. "We have a confession of malicious intent, an admission of sustained predatory behavior, and clear evidence that he knew his actions were harmful but continued anyway. This demonstrates the element of mens rea, the criminal intent, which is crucial for both criminal and civil proceedings." Richard explained that with the evidence we had gathered, he could build a case that would not only result in criminal consequences for Marcus, but also in civil damages that could easily reach $100,000 or more. The lawyer also gave us some important strategic advice about the timing of the family confrontation we were planning. He suggested we do it before filing any formal legal action, because once the proceedings began, Marcus would have a lawyer instructing him not to talk about anything. But if we could get him to incriminate himself even further during the family dinner, with witnesses present, that would make the case virtually uncontestable. Richard even offered a brilliant suggestion: record the entire dinner, Oregon is a one-party consent state for recordings, so you don't need to inform anyone that you're recording. Anything Marcus admits during this confrontation can be used legally in court. That weekend, Jessica and I began organizing what we internally called the last dinner. We decided to have it at our house on a Saturday in a week and a half, which gave us time to prepare everything meticulously. We sent invitations to our parents, Robert and Linda Carter, my sister Patricia and her husband Greg, my cousin Rachel, and obviously Marcus. The pretext was that we wanted to gather the family for an important announcement about our future. This ambiguous language was intentional because Marcus would interpret it as possibly being about divorce or separation, which would motivate him to definitely attend. Everyone confirmed their attendance, including Marcus, who responded to the invitation with an enthusiasm that now, in retrospect, was completely sinister. Meanwhile, we continued our investigation into Marcus's life. I hired a private investigator, something I never imagined doing in my life, a former Portland police officer named Mike Sullivan, who charged $150 an hour. Mike spent a week following Marcus, documenting his routine, his interactions, looking for any additional information that might be useful. What Mike discovered added more layers to the nightmare. Marcus was frequenting a tribal casino in Grande Ronde at least twice a week, spending hundreds of dollars on slot machines and blackjack tables. Mike obtained photos of him entering and leaving the casino on different days, always alone, always looking defeated when he left. Mike also discovered that Marcus had lied about where he was living. He had told the whole family he lived in a decent apartment in Beaverton, but in reality he was in a rented room, in a shared house in a not-so-nice area of Portland, paying only $600 a month because that was all he could afford. The apartment he showed in his social media photos actually belonged to his friend, a guy from the car dealership who let him use the place to pretend his life was better than it really was. This discovery made me realize how desperate Marcus was, how willing he was to lie and manipulate not only me and Jessica, but the whole family, maintaining a facade of success while sinking deeper and deeper into debt and despair. The investigator also discovered something particularly disturbing. Marcus had created fake social media profiles to monitor Jessica without her knowledge. He had at least 3 fake Instagram accounts with photos of random people, all following Jessica and regularly liking her photos. When Mike showed me the profiles, I recognized the usernames as some of Jessica's regular followers. She had interacted with these profiles thinking they were real people, interested in her posts about cooking and travel. It was another layer of surveillance, another violation of her privacy. Marcus was so obsessed that he had created multiple online personas just to have unrestricted access to my wife's digital life. During that week of preparation, something interesting happened. My anger began to transform into something colder, more focused. Initially, when I discovered everything, I wanted to confront Marcus immediately, perhaps even physically. But the more evidence we gathered, the more I saw the extent of his manipulation, the more I realized that quick revenge would be unsatisfying. He deserved something more elaborate, more devastating, something that would destroy not only his reputation, but also his sick fantasies. He had spent 2 years building a castle of lies, and I was going to spend the next few weeks ensuring that when that castle crumbled, the rubble would bury him completely. There would be no way for him to get up from there. There would be no fresh start in another city. Everyone would know exactly who Marcus Carter really was. Jessica was on the same page. One night while we were preparing the presentation, we would show at the family dinner, a sort of visual dossier with a timeline, screenshots, analyses, and even graphs showing the correlation between Marcus's messages and our marital arguments. She looked at me and said something that perfectly summed up our state of mind. When we break up with him, Marcus will wish we had just called the police on the first day. What we're about to do will follow him for the rest of his life. She was right. The legal process would only be part of it. The real destruction would be social and psychological. It would be seeing the disgust in our parents' eyes for who he really was. It would be losing the respect of the entire family. It would be living knowing that every important person in his life knew the truth. 3 days before dinner, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, looking surprised but happy to hear from me. The conversation was superficial. I asked about work. He asked about mine. We talked about the next Portland Trail Blazers game. It was surreal to talk to him normally, knowing everything I knew, pretending we were just two siblings keeping in touch. At the end of the call, I casually mentioned that I was looking forward to seeing him at dinner on Saturday, that I was sure it would be a memorable night. He enthusiastically agreed, saying he wouldn't miss it for the world. When I hung up, Jessica was watching me from the kitchen doorway. "Did you do it?" she asked. "I did," I replied. "He'll be there, happy and confident, without the slightest idea of what's about to happen." That week, I also began to emotionally process what it would mean to completely destroy my brother. There were moments of doubt, moments where old childhood memories surfaced. Him teaching me to tie my shoes, us building pillow forts in the living room, him crying on my shoulder when our grandmother died. These memories hurt because they showed that at some point, Marcus had been capable of genuine love and family connection. What happened to transform him into this person? Was it the envy accumulated over the years? Was it some deep resentment I never noticed? Or was there always something broken inside him, just waiting for the right opportunity to manifest? I would never know for sure, and eventually I realized it didn't matter. The reasons didn't justify the actions, and I had no obligation to be his therapist or his savior. On Friday before dinner, Jessica and I did a final check of all our preparations. We had printed and digital documentation of everything. Text messages organized chronologically, audio recordings of phone calls, reports from the private investigator with photos and observations, forensic analysis of the spyware that had been installed on her cell phone, even the original unedited images of the photos Marcus had manipulated to create false evidence of infidelity. We had prepared a 45-slide PowerPoint presentation that would be projected on our 65-inch TV in the dining room. Each slide was a piece of evidence. Each transition revealed a new layer of betrayal. It was professional, it was devastating, and it was completely irrefutable. We also rehearsed how we would conduct the revelation. Jessica would give the initial presentation, establishing the basic facts and the timeline. I would then supplement with the emotional details and the impact this had on our marriage. We would show the evidence progressively, starting with the subtlest messages and building up to the explicit audio confessions. The idea was to give Marcus no opportunity to interrupt or deflect. It would be an avalanche-type revelation where each new piece of evidence would be more damning than the last. And everything would be recorded on video by 3 different cameras discreetly positioned around the room, capturing every angle, every reaction, especially Marcus's when he realized his life as he knew it was over. There were less than 24 hours left. Saturday dawned with a typical Portland gray sky, the kind of day where rain threatens at any moment but never quite makes up its mind. Jessica woke up at 6 in the morning, 2 hours before her alarm, and I found her in the kitchen already preparing dinner. She had decided to make an elaborate menu: roast prime rib, scalloped potatoes, grilled asparagus, Caesar salad, and homemade apple pie for dessert. It might seem strange to put so much effort into food for an event that would result in family destruction. But Jessica explained that she wanted everything to seem normal and welcoming at first. The more comfortable Marcus felt initially, the more brutal the contrast would be when everything fell apart. It was strategic psychology, and I had to admit it made perverse sense. I spent the morning setting up the hidden cameras. I bought 3 mini security cameras at Best Buy during the week, each no bigger than a matchbox, and strategically positioned them around the dining room and kitchen. One was disguised as an artificial plant on the bookshelf, another behind books on the sideboard, and the third on top of the refrigerator at an angle to the dining table. I tested them all several times, ensuring the audio quality was perfect and that the angles captured the entire table where everyone would be seated. I also configured my laptop to start recording with a single click, discreetly hidden on the kitchen counter with the screen facing me. When I finished, at 11 in the morning, our documentation system was flawless and completely invisible. Around noon, I started to feel the nerves kicking in for the first time since we began all this planning. My hands trembled slightly as I arranged the chairs around the dining table, and I had to stop several times to take a deep breath. Jessica noticed and came over to me, placing her hands on my shoulders and looking me straight in the eyes. "We're doing the right thing, Daniel. He left us no choice. If we let this go, he would continue, and eventually he could do it to someone else, another family. We're not just protecting ourselves, we're protecting his future victims." Her words grounded me. She was right. This wasn't just personal revenge, it was responsibility. Marcus was a predator, and predators don't stop until they are stopped. The first guests arrived at 5:15 in the afternoon. It was my parents, Robert and Linda, arriving together in their green Subaru Outback that my father loved to drive. They were 72 and 69 years old, respectively, both retired. My father had been a high school history teacher, and my mother a nurse, professions that afforded them decent pensions and a comfortable house in Gresham. They arrived with a bottle of red wine and flowers for Jessica, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break. My mother commented on how happy she was to have the whole family together, saying that we didn't do this often enough. The irony of her words was almost physical, because after that night, family gatherings would never be the same again. Patricia and Greg arrived 15 minutes later, driving from Eugene where they lived. My older sister was 43, worked as a human resources manager at a lumber company, and Greg was a paramedic. They had 2 teenage children whom they left with a babysitter for the night. Patricia hugged me tightly at the door and whispered, "So, what's the big announcement? Are you finally pregnant?" I simply smiled enigmatically and told her she'd have to wait to find out. She playfully patted my arm, completely unaware that in a few hours she would be witnessing the implosion of her 2 siblings' relationship. Rachel arrived soon after, alone, wearing a black leather jacket and jeans, her typical cool bartender style. Marcus was the last to arrive at 6:05 p.m., exactly 5 minutes after the time we had asked everyone to be there. He arrived in his red Dodge Charger, which was always impeccably clean, despite the debts we knew he had. When I opened the door, he was grinning broadly, holding an expensive bottle of bourbon, probably bought with a maxed-out credit card. "Hey, man," he said, giving me one of those masculine hugs with a pat on the back. "The house is great, man, and it smells good." He greeted Jessica with a hug that lasted a second longer than it should have, and I saw her imperceptibly stiffen. He was wearing a blue dress shirt and dress pants. He had clearly dressed up for the occasion, thinking that perhaps this would be the night Jessica would announce her separation, and he could position himself as the comforting hero. For the first hour, everything proceeded with a painful normalcy. We served drinks, chatted about pleasantries. My father told old stories about when we were children. Marcus was particularly animated, laughing too loudly at jokes, refilling glasses, being excessively attentive to Jessica in ways that I now understood, but that to others seemed merely kindness. He offered to help her bring dishes from the kitchen, excessively praised her cooking, commented on how radiant she looked that evening. My mother, innocently, said that Marcus had always been so affectionate with the people he loves. I almost choked on my wine upon hearing this, but I maintained my composure. Rachel, however, gave me a knowing look. She knew something was off. She could feel the tension beneath the surface. When we finally sat down to dinner at 7:15, the table was beautifully set. Jessica had put out a white tablecloth, our nice china, and the crystal glasses we'd received as wedding gifts and never used. The prime rib was perfectly cooked, the scalloped potatoes golden and bubbling. Everything looked like it came straight out of a cooking magazine. Marcus sat directly across from me, with Jessica to my right at the head of the table, and our parents at the sides. The conversation during dinner was light. People complimented the food and shared updates on work and life. Marcus mentioned he was considering a promotion at the dealership, a lie I knew to be completely fabricated since the investigator had confirmed he was actually on probation for poor performance. Around 8 o'clock, after dessert had been served and everyone was relaxed with wine and good food, Jessica looked at me and nodded slightly. It was time. I stood up, felt all eyes turned to me, and said, "Everyone, thank you for coming today. Jessica and I actually have something important to share with you." There was a murmur of anticipation. My mother smiled hopefully, probably still imagining a pregnancy announcement. Marcus was leaning forward, his eyes shining with what looked like expectation. I discreetly activated the recording on the laptop behind me and continued. Over the past 2 weeks, Jessica and I have discovered something that has completely changed our understanding of trust, family, and loyalty. And we think it's important that you all know the truth. Jessica stood up and walked to the TV on the wall, picking up the remote. She turned on the television, and our PowerPoint presentation appeared on the screen. The title of the first slide was simple and devastating. Marcus Carter's 2-year campaign to destroy our marriage, a complete documentation. There was a confused silence. My mother frowned. Patricia looked perplexed. My father slowly put his fork down on his plate. Rachel didn't seem surprised, just resigned, as if she expected this moment to eventually come. But it was Marcus I watched most closely. His face went through a rapid progression of emotions. Confusion, then recognition, then something that looked like barely disguised panic. His smile faltered and died, and he began, "What is this? Is this some kind of joke?" "This is no joke, Marcus," Jessica said in a calm voice, but heavy with restrained emotion. "This is the truth about what you've done to us for the past 2 years, and you're going to sit there and listen to every word, because every person at this table deserves to know exactly who you really are." She clicked to the next slide, which showed the first text messages Marcus had sent her, dated 2 years ago. The texts appeared enlarged on the 65-inch screen, impossible to ignore or deny. My mother put her hand to her mouth. My father took off his glasses and nervously wiped them, something he always did when processing disturbing information. Patricia looked at Marcus and then at me, trying to understand what was happening. Jessica continued methodically, presenting slide after slide. She showed the progression of the messages, how they started subtly and became increasingly manipulative. She showed the specific lies Marcus told, how he fabricated stories about me cheating, about me being a bad husband, about me bad-mouthing her behind her back. Each allegation was presented with refuting evidence. When she showed GPS records from my work proving I was in meetings at the exact times Marcus claimed to see me with other women, my father shook his head in disbelief. Marcus tried to interrupt several times. "You're taking this out of context," or "I was just worried about you." But Jessica simply turned up the TV volume and continued. There was no room for his defenses, not yet. When Jessica got to the slide showing the spyware Marcus had installed on her phone, the atmosphere in the room changed drastically. This was no longer just family drama or sibling rivalry. This was a crime, stalking, invasion of privacy. My mother began to cry silently. Patricia was visibly shocked, her mouth agape in disbelief. Greg, always the calm emergency responder, had his arms crossed and watched Marcus with an expression that mixed disgust and analysis. Marcus was pale now, his hands visibly trembling on the table. He tried to stand up, but my father, in a tone he rarely used, said, "Sit down, Marcus. You're going to hear all of this." Marcus obeyed, sinking back into his chair like a cornered animal. Then came the part I was simultaneously anticipating and dreading, the audio recording. Jessica had edited it to include only the most incriminating moments, but even so, it lasted almost 5 minutes. Marcus's voice filled the room, confessing his feelings for Jessica, admitting that he had spent 2 years deliberately trying to break up our marriage, saying that I didn't deserve her and that he would be better for her. When the part where he offered to help her sue me for divorce played, my father abruptly stood up from the table and went out onto the balcony, unable to continue listening. My mother was sobbing now, repeating, "How could you? How could you do this to your own brother?" Patricia had tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of anger. She looked at Marcus as if she didn't recognize him. When the recording ended, the silence in the room was so thick I could hear the clock on the kitchen wall ticking. Marcus was completely still, staring at the empty plate in front of him, his fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles were white. I finally stood up and began my part of the presentation, my voice surprisingly steady, considering the whirlwind of emotions inside me. "You've just seen and heard only a fraction of the evidence," I began, walking slowly around the table. "We have over 50 pages of documented messages, multiple audio recordings, forensic evidence of illegal software installed without consent, and explicit confessions of malicious intent. Marcus wasn't just being a concerned or jealous brother. He was running a calculated and premeditated campaign to destroy my marriage so he could try to steal my wife." I then showed her the slides with the digitally manipulated photos, the original images side by side with the edited versions Marcus had sent to Jessica. My mother groaned when she saw how far Marcus had gone to fabricate false evidence. Patricia looked at Marcus and asked in a trembling voice, "Why, Marcus? Why would you do something so sick?" Marcus finally looked up, and for the first time I saw something other than panic on his face. It was anger, unexpected and inappropriate considering the situation. "You don't understand anything," he said hoarsely. "You don't know what it's like to always live in the shadow of the perfect brother. Daniel always had it easy. He was always the favorite. He always got the girl, the job, the perfect life. And me, I was always the failure, the disappointment. Your attempt to play the victim was so pathetic I almost laughed. So that justifies stalking. That justifies installing spyware on my wife's phone. That justifies spending 2 years lying and manipulating to try and destroy my family." My voice was rising now, all the careful control starting to crack. "You're not a victim of anything, Marcus. You're a predator. A predator who used our blood relation as cover to do absolutely deplorable things. And you know what's even more pathetic? You didn't do it out of love or passion. You did it because you're broke, desperate, and thought you could manipulate Jessica into becoming your financial lifeline after destroying our marriage." This caught everyone's attention. My father had returned from the balcony upon hearing my raised voice, and now everyone was looking at Marcus, expecting a denial that didn't come. Jessica seized the moment and showed the next slides, the financial reports our private investigator had compiled. Credit card debt totaling $42,300, 3 months overdue on the car payment. Imminent eviction from the room he rented because he hadn't paid for 6 weeks. Casino records showing losses of over $15,000 in the last 8 months. And then, the most revealing slide, text messages between Marcus and a friend where he explicitly discussed how Jessica earned an excellent salary as a data analyst and had substantial savings that could solve all his problems if he could position himself in her life. My mother was inconsolable now, hiding her face in her hands. Patricia had stood up and was standing behind Marcus's chair, looking at him with an expression I can only describe as absolute horror. Rachel, who already knew parts of the story, simply shook her head sadly. Greg kept his arm around Patricia, offering silent support. It was my father who finally broke the silence with a voice I had never heard before, laden with disappointment so profound it felt physical. "Marcus Robert Carter, you are no longer my son." He said it so definitively, so finally, that even Marcus seemed to physically recoil. "Don't come to our house, don't call us. You are dead to this family." Marcus finally reacted, rising so abruptly that his chair fell backward with a thud. "You can all go to hell," he shouted, his voice breaking. "You've always treated me like trash. It's always been Daniel this, Daniel that. Well, now you know I at least tried to do something about it." He pointed at me with a trembling finger. "You don't deserve her, Daniel. You never deserved her. Jessica deserves someone who truly values her, not a selfish workaholic who barely notices when she exists." His words were pure projection, trying to justify the unjustifiable, but they revealed exactly how distorted his perception of reality was. He had truly convinced himself that he was doing something noble, saving Jessica from me. Jessica, who had remained relatively calm throughout the presentation, finally lost her composure. She approached Marcus, stopping just a few feet from him, and said in an icy voice, "You're pathetic. You think you value me. You violated me, Marcus. You invaded every aspect of my private life. You read my conversations with my therapist about my anxiety and used that information to manipulate me. You tracked my location as if I were your property. You don't love me, you don't even know me. I'm just an object to you, a solution to your financial problems, and a trophy you think your brother doesn't deserve. You disgust me." The starkness of her words clearly struck Marcus in a way none of the evidence had. His face crumbled, shifting from anger to something that looked like genuine despair. But we weren't finished with the revelations. I had saved one last bombshell for the end. Jessica moved to the final slide, which showed legal documents already prepared. "We've already filed a criminal complaint against you, Marcus," I said, maintaining direct eye contact with him. "Unauthorized access to electronic devices, stalking, cyber harassment. Our lawyer, Richard Brennan, has already submitted everything to the Multnomah County District Attorney's Office. You are being formally charged with multiple crimes, each punishable by up to 1 year in prison and thousands of dollars in fines. We are also suing you civilly for intentional emotional distress, seeking $100,000 in damages. And we obtained a temporary restraining order that will be officially served on you Monday morning. You cannot approach me or Jessica within 500 feet. You cannot contact us by any means. And if you violate this, you go straight to jail." Marcus staggered as if he'd been punched. "You can't do this," he whispered, but without conviction. He knew we could, and we already had. "But wait, there's more," Jessica added, and I could hear the grim satisfaction in her voice. "We've already contacted the management of the dealership where you work. They've been informed about your criminal activities involving technology and invasion of privacy. Considering you work with sensitive customer information and have access to personal data, they've already indicated they'll terminate your employment immediately. You'll receive your termination notice on Monday." She paused to let it sink in. "Oh, and about that room you rent. We contacted the landlord and informed him about your criminal activities. He's already initiated formal eviction proceedings. What we did next may seem cruel, but it was necessary. We shared printed copies of a summary of the evidence with each family member present. Each person received a 10-page packet with the most damning highlights. screenshots of messages, transcripts of the audio confession, photos from the spyware, all organized in a way that left no doubt about Marcus's guilt. We also included information on how they could be called as witnesses in the legal proceedings to come. We wanted to ensure that even after everyone went home, when the initial shock wore off, they would have concrete evidence in hand to remind them that this really happened, that it wasn't an exaggeration or a misunderstanding. Marcus stood in the middle of the dining room now, surrounded by family members who looked at him as if he were a stranger. My mother couldn't even look in his direction. My father had retreated to the balcony, his hands resting on the railing, his shoulders hunched with disappointment. Patricia was openly crying, not for Marcus, but for what this revelation meant for the family, for the lost innocence of believing we knew each other completely. Rachel picked up her evidence package and said aloud to no one in particular, "I tried to warn him. Months ago I said this would blow up in his face, but he didn't listen. He never listens. I'm going to sue you for defamation," Marcus finally said, searching for some form of threat, some control over the situation. "I'm going to prove you edited those messages, that you falsified that evidence." It was a pathetic last-ditch effort from someone drowning in consequences. "Go ahead," I replied calmly. "We have the original metadata for everything. We have expert witnesses who can attest to the authenticity of every piece of evidence. We have your own friend with whom you discussed the plan, and yes, he already agreed to testify in exchange for immunity because he was worried about the legal implications of knowing about your actions and not reporting them. You have no way out, Marcus. You can try to fight, but every move you make will only dig yourself deeper into the hole." That's when something broke inside Marcus. His knees buckled and he collapsed onto the dining room floor, not dramatically, but like someone whose legs had simply stopped working. He wasn't crying, just sitting there on the rug Jessica and I had bought at a craft fair last year, staring at his own hands as if he didn't recognize them. "I destroyed everything," he murmured to himself. "Everything." It wasn't a revelation that elicited sympathy from anyone present. It was merely the belated recognition of consequences that were entirely of his own making. Greg, ever pragmatic, asked if we should call someone, perhaps a mental health professional, worried that Marcus might be a danger to himself. But Marcus got up on his own after a moment, walked past us all without looking at anyone, and headed straight for the front door. Before leaving, he stopped with his hand on the doorknob, his back still turned to us. "I really loved her," he said quietly, as if that explained or justified anything. "No, you didn't," Jessica replied from the dining room, her voice echoing down the hallway. "You were obsessed, you were selfish. You wanted to possess something your brother had because you can't build anything of your own. That's not love, Marcus. That's pathology." Marcus didn't answer. He simply opened the door and drove out into the rainy Portland night, getting into his red Charger that would likely be repossessed in a matter of weeks. We watched through the windows as he drove away, the taillights disappearing into the rain, and there was a collective sense of relief mixed with deep sadness for what our family had lost. Not the Marcus we'd exposed, but the brother we thought we knew, and who perhaps never truly existed. After Marcus left, the family stayed for another hour, no one really knowing how to process what had just happened. My mother was devastated, alternating between blaming herself and trying to understand where they had gone wrong in raising him. My father was quietly furious, the kind of anger that comes from feeling betrayed by someone you protected and loved unconditionally. Patricia hugged me for a long time before leaving, whispering, "I'm so sorry, Danny. You and Jessica didn't deserve this, and I'm glad you exposed him before he caused even more harm." Rachel was the last to leave, stopping at the door to give me some surprising advice. "Keep the security cameras on for a while. Marcus wasn't well when he left here. I don't think he would do anything violent, but desperate people do unpredictable things." When we were finally alone, Jessica and I sat on the living room sofa, surrounded by the remains of dinner, the plates still on the table, the printed evidence scattered like debris from an explosion. We didn't speak for a long time, just sat there holding hands, processing everything that had happened. "It's over," Jessica finally said, but her voice lacked the triumphant satisfaction I had hoped for. It sounded more like exhaustion, relief, and a residual sadness for what it all represented about human nature and family. "It's not completely over yet," I replied. "There's still the legal process, the trial, all the formalities. But the important part, exposing the truth and protecting our family from further manipulation, that's done. And we did it the right way, with evidence, with dignity, without stooping to his level." As we cleaned the kitchen that night, working side by side in comfortable silence, I realized something important. Marcus's plan had failed, not only because we found out, but because he fundamentally misinterpreted what Jessica and I had. He thought our marriage was fragile enough to be broken by planted doubts and elaborate lies. But what he didn't understand was that strong relationships aren't built on the absence of problems. They're built on how you deal with problems together. The last 2 weeks, working side by side to expose his betrayal, had actually strengthened our marriage in ways he could never have predicted. His attempt to destroy us had inadvertently brought us closer together, made us more aware of the value of what we had, and made us more committed to protecting it. The night after dinner, neither Jessica nor I could sleep properly. We stayed awake until 3 in the morning, tossing and turning in bed, our minds repeatedly processing every moment of the confrontation. I kept seeing the expression on my mother's face as she realized the extent of Marcus's betrayal, the way my father simply collapsed emotionally and had to go out onto the balcony. Jessica was processing Marcus's final words, that pathetic statement that he truly loved her. She confessed to me that part of her, a very small part, felt something akin to pity for him, not for what we did, but for the broken person he clearly was. But then she remembered the therapy sessions he had spied on, the intimate conversations he had violated, and any spark of empathy instantly vanished. Sunday morning dawned, and my phone started ringing at 7:30 a.m. It was Patricia. She'd also been sleepless all night and wanted to know if Jessica and I were okay, if we needed anything. She also shared something that made me realize the consequences of what we'd done were only beginning to unfold. Marcus had called her at 4 a.m., completely drunk, alternating between incoherent apologies and angry accusations that the whole family had always been against him. Patricia hung up after 5 minutes, unable to cope with the level of denial and self-pity he was displaying. She then blocked his number, something she never imagined she'd do to her own brother. Later that morning, we discovered he'd tried calling practically everyone in the family, including distant cousins who barely knew the situation, looking for someone, anyone, who would believe his version of events. My mother called around 10 o'clock, her voice still hoarse from crying. "Daniel, I need to ask you something," she began hesitantly. "Are you absolutely sure about all of this? Isn't there a possibility that some of the evidence was misinterpreted?" I could hear in her voice that desperate motherly desire to find some alternative explanation that would save her son. But I had anticipated this reaction. "Mom, I understand this is devastating for you, but we have forensic evidence, audio confessions, expert witnesses, digital records with timestamps that can't be falsified. Marcus not only admitted everything, he elaborated on his motivations. This isn't a misunderstanding or an exaggeration. It's documentation of systematic criminal behavior over 2 years." There was a long silence on the line, and then she simply said, "I created a monster," and hung up before I could respond. That afternoon, Jessica and I received an unexpected visit. It was Rachel, accompanied by a guy I vaguely recognized as Tyler. one of Marcus's co-workers at the dealership. Tyler seemed extremely uncomfortable, shifting his weight from one foot to the other on our porch, clearly not wanting to be there. Rachel explained that Tyler had information we felt we should know, and that he only agreed to come because she assured him we wouldn't hold him responsible for anything. We invited them inside, and what Tyler told us added an even more disturbing dimension to the situation. Marcus had spent the last 6 months at work obsessed with Jessica, showing pictures of her to colleagues, talking about her constantly, even using his work computer to stalk her on social media during work hours. Tyler explained that several colleagues had been uncomfortable with Marcus's behavior, but no one knew that Jessica was married to his brother until recently. Marcus presented the situation as if it were an unrequited romantic interest in a woman he knew, conveniently omitting the part about her being his sister-in-law. Tyler had seen Marcus using Photoshop on his work computer several times, and now realized he was probably creating those fake images he used to try to convince Jessica that I was cheating. The dealership manager, a man named Dave Mitchell, had already been informed about part of the situation after they received our email on Friday, and was conducting an internal investigation into the misuse of company resources. Marcus would be officially fired on Monday, not only for his personal actions, but also for professional misconduct and improper use of company property. But Tyler had come primarily to warn us about something specific. Marcus had made troubling comments on Friday after work, before dinner, when he didn't know he would soon be exposed. He had drunk some beers with Tyler and other colleagues at a nearby bar, and had spoken disturbingly about how he sometimes thought about doing something drastic to get what he wanted. Tyler wasn't sure if Marcus was talking about Jessica specifically, or about his life situation in general, but the words had been troubling enough for Tyler to remember them. After hearing about Saturday's events through Rachel, Tyler felt he had a responsibility to warn us that Marcus might be in an unstable and potentially dangerous mental state. He didn't think Marcus would do anything violent, but stressed that he couldn't guarantee anything considering the level of desperation he had observed. After Tyler and Rachel left, Jessica and I had a serious conversation about security. We decided to implement some additional precautions, at least until the official restraining order was served and we could better assess the situation. We installed additional security cameras outside the house, covering all entrances and the parking lot. We changed the locks on all the doors, even knowing that Marcus never had keys, just to be absolutely sure. Jessica would start working from home for a few weeks instead of going to the office, reducing the predictability of her movements. And I contacted our lawyer, Richard Brennan, to ask about the possibility of expediting the permanent restraining order. Considering the new information about Marcus's potentially unstable mental state, Richard advised us to document any attempt at contact Marcus made, no matter how innocuous it seemed. He explained that building a pattern of harassment behavior after being informed of the legal consequences would only strengthen our case and could result in harsher penalties. He also suggested that we proactively inform the Portland police about the situation, not to file a formal complaint yet, but to have a record that we expressed safety concerns. That way, if something happened, there would be prior documentation establishing context and history. We followed his advice and visited the Portland Police's 12th precinct that afternoon, where we spoke with an officer named Sergeant James Rodriguez, who took our concerns seriously and created an informative report in the system. On Monday morning, while I was at work trying to maintain some semblance of productivity, I received a call from an unknown number. I normally wouldn't answer, but something made me press the green button. It was the landlord of the room Marcus rented, an older gentleman named Frank Delgado. "Mr. Carter," he began formally, "I received your email regarding your brother's criminal activities. I wanted to inform you that he showed up here last night, Sunday, extremely drunk, asking for more time to pay the overdue rent. When I refused and mentioned the eviction process, he had a complete emotional breakdown in my front yard. The neighbors almost called the police. Eventually, he left, but left behind several boxes of belongings that he was apparently trying to move to his car and couldn't. Frank asked if I knew how he could contact Marcus to come pick up his things, since he wasn't answering calls or messages. I explained that we were under a restraining order and couldn't contact him directly, but suggested Frank leave the boxes in the garage for now. And if Marcus didn't pick them up within 30 days, he could legally dispose of them. Frank agreed, but then added something that sent a chill down my spine. "Mr. Carter, I've seen a lot of people in bad situations over the years. Your brother is in a very dark place. I'm not saying this to elicit sympathy, but as a warning. Desperate men do desperate things. Take care of your wife and yourself." This was the second person in 24 hours warning us about Marcus's mental state, and I was beginning to take these warnings very seriously. That afternoon, Jessica was working from home when she noticed a strange car parked on the street in front of our house. It wasn't Marcus's red Charger. It was an older grey Honda Civic that she didn't recognize. The car sat there for almost 40 minutes with someone sitting in the driver's seat, but she couldn't clearly see who it was through the tinted glass. She called me immediately, and I advised her not to leave the house and to call the police if the car was still there in another 15 minutes. Jessica started recording through our security cameras, capturing the vehicle and the license plate. 10 minutes later, the car finally drove away. When we checked the slow-motion recording and zoomed in, we could clearly see the face through the windshield the moment the car pulled away. It was Marcus, driving a car he had presumably borrowed from someone, since his was probably on its way to being repossessed. This changed everything. Marcus had violated the temporary restraining order even before it was officially served, and he had done so in a way that demonstrated premeditation, using a different vehicle presumably to avoid detection. Jessica immediately called Richard Brennan while I left work and drove home as fast as traffic laws allowed. Richard instructed Jessica to file a police report immediately and send him all the security camera footage. He explained that this transformed the situation from concerning to potentially dangerous, and that he would initiate emergency procedures to obtain a protective restraining order with immediate police enforcement. This meant that if Marcus approached us again, he could be arrested on the spot without the need for a preliminary hearing. When I got home 20 minutes later, I found Jessica visibly shaken for the first time since it all began. She had always been the strong one, the analytical one, the one who kept her composure even when we presented the evidence at dinner. But knowing that Marcus had been there just a few feet away from her, watching our house while she was alone inside, had pierced her armor of calm. I hugged her in the kitchen, and she finally let out all the tension that had accumulated over the past few weeks, crying in a way I rarely saw her cry. "I should be feeling avenged," she sobbed against my chest. "We exposed him. We ruined him. He's losing everything. So why do I feel scared? Why does it feel like this isn't over yet?" I didn't have a good answer for that because I felt exactly the same way. We had won the battle of exposure, but the war of consequences was only just beginning. The police sent 2 officers to our house within an hour of Jessica's call. They reviewed the security footage, took detailed statements, and confirmed they had sufficient grounds to issue a search warrant for Marcus for violation of a restraining order and possible stalking. One of the officers, a woman named Officer Sarah Chen, had specific experience with stalking and domestic violence cases. She sat us down in the living room and had a very straightforward conversation with us about security protocol. Statistically, the first 30 days after a restraining order is issued are the most dangerous, she explained with a seriousness that was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. The abuser realizes they are losing control and access, and sometimes takes desperate measures. You did the right thing installing cameras and changing locks. Now I recommend a few more things. Officer Chen gave us a list of additional precautions. Vary our routes to work, inform trusted neighbors about the situation so they could be alert to suspicious activity. Consider personal alarms or GPS devices we could use to quickly call for help if needed. And most importantly, trust our instincts. If something seems wrong, if you feel you are being watched or followed, call 911 immediately. Don't wait to be sure. Don't worry about sounding paranoid. In situations like this, healthy paranoia can save lives. His words were frightening but necessary. We had spent so much time focusing on legal justice and social revenge that we hadn't fully processed that Marcus could pose a real physical threat, especially now that he had literally lost everything and had nothing left to lose. That night, Jessica and I talked at length about whether we had done the right thing by exposing him the way we did. We didn't question the justice of our actions or the validity of holding him accountable, but we wondered if we could have done things differently that wouldn't have resulted in him being potentially dangerous. Eventually, we concluded that we couldn't. Marcus had made conscious and sustained choices over 2 years. He had multiple opportunities to stop, to seek help, to confess, and to try to make amends. Instead, he doubled down on his predatory behavior. The consequences he was facing were a direct result of his own actions, not our reactions. We had simply documented the truth and presented it in a way that couldn't be denied or minimized. If he chose to respond to it in a self-destructive or dangerous way, that would be yet another demonstration of his character flaw, not our cruelty. On Tuesday morning, the situation escalated in a way none of us had anticipated. I was in a project meeting in the office when my assistant, a woman named Maria Rodriguez, interrupted to say she had an urgent call from Richard Brennan. I excused myself from the meeting and answered in my private office, and what Richard told me chilled me to the bone. Marcus had been formally fired from the dealership that morning, as expected, but his reaction had been violent and disturbing. According to multiple witnesses, including manager Dave Mitchell, Marcus had destroyed his own workstation, throwing his computer on the floor, tearing up documents, and shouting obscenities at me and Jessica. Security guards had to escort him out of the building while he threatened to sue the company, me, and anyone involved in his downfall, in his own words. But what was most troubling was what he had shouted as he was being removed from the building. Multiple witnesses heard him say something like, "They're going to pay for destroying my life. I'm going to make sure they understand what they took from me." Richard explained that while those words could be interpreted as vague threats, they weren't specific enough to warrant immediate arrest, but they would definitely be added to our case and the request for a permanent restraining order. The dealership had filed a police report about the destruction of property, and now Marcus faced not only our criminal and civil lawsuits, but also possible charges of vandalism and disorderly conduct. He was literally imploding his own life in real time, and we were just watching the wreckage pile up. I called Jessica immediately after hanging up with Richard, and she already knew. My cousin Rachel had called minutes earlier, having heard about the incident through the gossip network of bartenders and service staff in Portland, which was apparently surprisingly efficient. Rachel was genuinely worried now, no longer just about the situation in general, but specifically about what Marcus might do. She mentioned that she had received text messages from him during the night, long, incoherent rants about family betrayal and how he was going to prove everyone wrong about him. The messages weren't directly threatening, but they had a manic tone that made her so uncomfortable that she had also blocked his number, joining practically every other family member who had already done the same. That afternoon, something unexpected happened that significantly changed the dynamics of the situation. Marcus's and my mother, Linda Carter, showed up at our door unannounced. Jessica let her in hesitantly, and I came home early from work when Jessica texted me saying she needed emotional backup. My mother was sitting in our living room, looking like she'd aged 10 years in 3 days. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hands trembling as she held a cup of tea Jessica had made. "Daniel," she began as I sat down across from her, "I didn't come here to defend Marcus or ask you to reconsider the legal action. He did terrible things and needs to face the consequences. I came here as your mother, not his, to ask you to be careful. He called me this morning after being fired, and I've never heard my son like that before. He wasn't just angry or desperate, he was detached from reality." My mother explained that during that call, Marcus had alternated between moments of clarity, where he recognized he had ruined everything, and moments of delirium, where he seemed genuinely to believe he was the victim of an elaborate family conspiracy to destroy him. He mentioned several times that he had nothing left to lose, a phrase that anyone trained in crisis management recognizes as potentially dangerous. My mother, who had worked as a psychiatric nurse for 15 years before switching to general nursing, recognized the signs of someone in serious psychological crisis. She had tried to convince him to seek professional help, perhaps voluntarily checking himself into a psychiatric ward for a few days, but he had laughed her off and hung up. She had called back multiple times, but he no longer answered. Linda then asked us for something I never expected to hear from her. She requested permission to include in our legal proceedings a mandatory petition for a psychiatric evaluation for Marcus. She genuinely believed he was experiencing some kind of mental breakdown, not as an excuse for his actions, but as a factor that needed to be addressed. "If he's going to lose everything anyway, at least he should get some kind of professional help," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't want my son to end up in prison without ever receiving treatment for what's clearly wrong in his head. And selfishly, I don't want to wake up one day and discover he did something irreversible because he was having a psychological breakdown and no one intervened." Her brutal vulnerability and honesty caught me off guard. I promised I would talk to Richard about adding this petition to our proceedings. After my mother left, Jessica and I sat in silence for a long time. The situation had evolved from justified revenge to something far more complex and dark. We were no longer just dealing with a manipulator being brought to justice. We were potentially dealing with someone in severe mental crisis who could be unpredictable and dangerous. Part of me felt a spark of genuine concern for Marcus, not the Marcus who had tortured us for 2 years, but the younger brother I helped learn to ride a bike, who cried on my shoulder when our dog died, who existed before all this went terribly wrong. But that spark was quickly stifled by the memory of what he had done. The systematic violation of Jessica's privacy, the calculated manipulation, the elaborate lies. Compassion didn't mean letting him escape the consequences. It meant ensuring that the consequences included the help he clearly needed. On Wednesday, things took an even more disturbing turn. Jessica was working from home when our security system alerted us to movement in the backyard. The cameras captured someone jumping over our 6-foot-high wooden fence at 2:35 p.m., a time when they clearly thought we wouldn't be home. Jessica, thank God, was upstairs in the office and saw the alert on her cell phone. She immediately locked the office door, called 911, and texted me that simply said, "Someone broke into the backyard. Police on the way. I'm locked in the office." My heart nearly stopped when I saw that message. I left the office without explanation, jumped in the car, and drove the 15 minutes home in under 8, breaking multiple traffic laws in the process. When I arrived, there were 2 police cars already parked in front of the house, lights flashing. The officers had found evidence that someone had been in the yard, boot prints in the damp soil near the kitchen window. But the intruder had fled before the police arrived, likely hearing the approaching sirens. What they found was what truly elevated the situation to a new level of seriousness. Stuck in the back fence, where the intruder had clearly climbed hastily to escape, was a torn piece of fabric from a shirt. And in the grass near the kitchen window, the officers found a cell phone that had fallen, presumably from the intruder's pocket during the hasty escape. The phone was locked, but when the officers checked the records using the number, they confirmed it belonged to Marcus Robert Carter. This changed everything legally. Marcus had not only violated the temporary restraining order, he had committed trespassing, a more serious crime. The police immediately issued an arrest warrant for him, and all officers on duty in Portland were notified to search for him. Officer Chen, who responded as one of the officers on the scene since she had been the first to handle our case, explained that Marcus would now be arrested as soon as he was located, not just served with a summons. He would spend at least one night in the Multnomah County Jail and have a bail hearing where a judge would decide if he posed a sufficient danger to be held until trial. With his escalating behavior, his lack of financial or housing stability, and now trespassing, there was a good chance that bail would be denied or set at an amount he couldn't afford. Jessica was visibly shaken after the incident. The reality that Marcus had literally been trying to break into our house while she was alone inside had shattered any sense of security she still held. We decided that night that we couldn't stay in the house for the time being, at least not until Marcus was arrested and the situation stabilized. We packed for a week and moved into a hotel in Beaverton, a Marriott courtyard near the airport where I had enough loyalty program points to cover an extended stay if needed. We only informed a very small number of people about our whereabouts. My parents, Patricia, Richard Brennan, and my boss, Tom Henderson, who needed to know why I would be working remotely indefinitely. Even Rachel didn't know exactly where we were, only that we had left the house for safety. The next 3 days were surreal. Living in a hotel room, working from laptops, ordering takeout, constantly checking our phones for police updates on Marcus's location. It was like being a protected witness, except the danger was someone I'd grown up sharing a room with. Richard Brennan kept us updated on legal developments. The Multnomah County District Attorney had taken the case personally, after reviewing the extent of the evidence, recognizing that this was a case that would set an important precedent for cyberstalking crimes in Oregon. They were preparing charges that included multiple counts of unauthorized access to computer systems, stalking, harassment, trespassing, and violation of a restraining order. If convicted on all counts, Marcus was looking at potentially 3 to 5 years in state prison. On Thursday night, we finally received the call we'd been waiting for. Marcus had been located and arrested. An officer patrolling the Old Town Portland area recognized him from a search warrant, sitting alone in a bar called Rosie's Tavern, drinking cheap whiskey and staring blankly at the wall. When officers approached, Marcus did not resist arrest. He simply put his hands behind his back and allowed them to handcuff him without saying a word, according to the report. He was taken to the Multnomah County Justice Jail, booked, and placed in a holding cell awaiting his court appearance, scheduled for Friday morning. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes. His stubble was patchy and blotchy, and he walked with the slumped shoulders of someone completely defeated. When his eyes swept across the room and landed on me and Jessica sitting in the galleries, something crossed his face, something between anger, shame, and despair. He quickly looked away and focused on the floor, while his public defender, a young lawyer who looked like she had just graduated from law school, tried to quickly review the voluminous case with him in the few minutes before the judge entered. The judge presiding over the hearing was a woman in her 50s named Judge Margaret Stevenson, with grey hair pulled back in a severe bun and an expression that tolerated no nonsense. She entered the room with firm steps. Everyone stood automatically, and when she banged the gavel and asked everyone to sit, there was an authority in her voice that immediately established that this was her room and her rules would be followed without question. These are not trivial charges. These are serious offenses that demonstrate a pattern of predatory, premeditated, and escalating behavior over a substantial period of time. Do you understand the gravity of the situation you find yourself in? Marcus simply nodded, his voice seeming to have disappeared completely. The public defender beside him nudged his arm and whispered something, and he finally murmured a "Yes, Your Honor," that was barely audible even in the small, quiet courtroom. The assistant prosecutor, a man named David Chen, who appeared to be about 40 years old, and dressed in an impeccable grey suit, rose to present the state's position on bail. "Your Honor," he began, "the state respectfully requests that bail be denied or set at a substantial amount. The defendant has demonstrated escalating behavior culminating in physical invasion of the victim's residence, while a restraining order was in effect. He has no fixed address, having recently been evicted. He is unemployed, having been dismissed due to conduct related to this case. He has no significant ties to the community that would ensure his attendance at future hearings. And most concerningly, he has demonstrated a pattern of complete disregard for court orders and the law. The defendant represents both a flight risk and a potential threat to the safety of the victims." The public defender, who identified herself as Amanda Foster, made a valiant but visibly weak attempt to argue for reasonable bail. "Your Honor," she said in a voice lacking conviction, "my client has no prior criminal record prior to this incident. He is a long-time resident of Portland, Oregon, with family in the area." After both sides presented their arguments, Judge Stevenson spent several minutes silently reviewing the documents again, creating a palpable tension in the room. Marcus was completely still, staring at his handcuffed hands in his lap. Jessica was beside me, her hand gripping mine tightly enough to hurt, but I didn't care. Finally, the judge looked up and began to speak, and her words were devastating to Marcus. "You violated her most intimate privacy by accessing therapeutic communications, and when you were finally exposed and a restraining order was issued, your response was not contrition or compliance, but escalation. You invaded their private residence in broad daylight. This pattern tells me that you either cannot or will not control your behavior, and that you represent a clear and present risk to the victims in this case." She paused, letting her words hang in the heavy air of the room. "Therefore, bail is denied. You will remain detained in the Multnomah County Jail until your trial. Your next hearing is scheduled for 3 weeks from now, on May 22nd, for formal appearance and presentation of your defense." When the gavel fell, finalizing the decision, something visibly broke inside Marcus. His shoulders began to tremble, and I realized he was silently crying, tears streaming down his unshaven face as guards approached to escort him back to jail. For a brief moment, our eyes met across the courtroom, and what I saw there was not anger or defiance, but complete and utter defeat. It was the look of someone who had finally fully grasped the consequences of his actions, and realized there was no going back, no fixing, no scenario where everything would be all right again. Then he looked away, was led away by the guards through the side door, and disappeared back into the detention system. Jessica and I sat for a moment after everyone left the room, just processing what had happened. Part of me felt a grim satisfaction at seeing justice served so definitively. Marcus was finally facing real and serious consequences for his actions. But another part of me, a smaller but persistent part, felt something I didn't want to admit. Sadness. Not sadness for what Marcus had become or for what he had chosen to do, but sadness for what he could have been, for the brother I thought I had, for the family relationship that was irrevocably destroyed. Jessica squeezed my hand and whispered, "Can we go home now?" And I realized she was right. Not literally, but metaphorically. With Marcus detained, we could finally begin the process of rebuilding some sense of normalcy and security in our lives. Richard Brennan met us outside the courtroom and explained the next legal steps. The criminal case would run its course through the system, likely resulting in some kind of plea bargain given the overwhelming strength of the evidence, though that would depend on Marcus and his public defender. Simultaneously, our civil suit for emotional distress would proceed, though Richard honestly admitted that even if we won a large judgment, it would be difficult to collect substantial money from someone who was financially ruined. But the goal was never really about money, I told him. It was about accountability, official documentation, and ensuring that this followed him forever. Richard nodded in understanding. Some cases are about financial justice. Others are about establishing truth in the public record. This is definitely the latter. We spent the weekend finally beginning to decompress. With Marcus locked up and unable to contact or threaten us, some of the tension we had carried for weeks began to dissipate. We returned to our home for the first time since the break-in incident, and although it initially felt strange and violated, it gradually began to feel like ours again. We changed the alarm system codes, installed additional motion sensors, and Jessica spent an entire Saturday reorganizing the house, which her therapist later explained was a common way to regain a sense of control and ownership over a space that had been violated. I spent the time doing maintenance and improvements I had postponed for months, keeping my hands and mind occupied with physical tasks that had clear and satisfying beginnings and ends. On Sunday, we had family visiting. My parents came first, bringing homemade food that my mother had prepared, her universal love language. My father, who wasn't normally a man of grand emotional displays, hugged me tightly at the door and whispered, "I'm so sorry you had to go through this, son. No father should have to choose between children, but Marcus left me no choice. He made his bed, and now he has to lie in it." My mother was more emotional, alternating between checking if we were okay and expressing her devastation over what Marcus had become. She had visited him in jail on Saturday, against the advice of practically everyone, and described the experience as heartbreaking, her word. "He's completely broken," she said, "not justifying anything he did, but he's not mentally well. He's under suicide watch in jail." That last piece of information was like a punch to the gut. No matter what Marcus had done, no matter how much he had hurt us, the idea of him being so desperate that he was under suicide prevention surveillance was deeply disturbing. Jessica saw the expression on my face and gently reminded me, "You're not responsible for his choices, Daniel. Not for what he did to get here, nor for how he's dealing with the consequences. If he's in a mental crisis, the prison system has protocols and professionals for that. Your responsibility is to us, to our family, to our future." She was right, of course, but it didn't make it any easier to process. The line between justice and cruelty sometimes seemed frighteningly thin, even when you were absolutely certain you were on the right side of it. Patricia and Greg came in the afternoon, bringing their 2 teenage children, my 16-year-old nephew Jake and my 14-year-old niece Emma. Initially, I found it strange that they brought the children considering the seriousness of the situation. But Patricia explained that she wanted them to understand that actions have real and serious consequences. That family is no excuse for abusive behavior, and that sometimes doing the right thing means making difficult decisions. She obviously didn't go into all the disturbing details with them, but gave an age-appropriate version of how Uncle Marcus had made very bad choices that hurt people and was now facing legal consequences. Jake, who had always admired Marcus for some reason I never fully understood, seemed particularly shaken by the news. During that weekend, we also began receiving messages and calls from people in the community who had heard about the situation through Portland's inevitable gossip network. Some were genuinely supportive, offering help or simply wanting to express that they were thinking of us. Others were clearly just curious, looking for sordid details to gossip about. We quickly learned to distinguish between the two and responded accordingly. What was surprising was how many women contacted Jessica specifically. Some she knew well, others were just distant acquaintances, sharing their own experiences with stalking, harassment, or controlling behavior from men in their lives. This transformed our personal experience into something bigger, an awareness of how common and underreported this type of behavior truly was. The following Monday, I returned to work full-time for the first time in almost 2 weeks. My boss, Tom Henderson, called me into a private meeting where he expressed his full support and offered company resources if needed, including access to counseling services through the health plan. He also informed me that they had updated security measures in the office building, adding Marcus's photo to the watch list at reception, just to ensure he couldn't show up at my workplace if he were eventually released from jail. I appreciated the proactive approach, even knowing that Marcus probably wouldn't be out anytime soon. My co-workers were mostly respectful and discreet, although I noticed occasional glances and whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. It was uncomfortable, but understandable. Jessica also returned to her office, a modern tech company in the Pearl District with open spaces and a startup culture. Her experience was a little different from mine. Her direct manager, a woman named Priya Sharma, had been incredibly supportive and even proposed that Jessica give a company-wide talk on personal cybersecurity and warning signs of digital stalking, turning her horrific experience into an educational opportunity for others. Jessica was initially hesitant, the wound still very fresh, but eventually agreed to give the presentation in a few weeks when she felt more ready. It was a way to reclaim narrative and agency, to transform victimization into empowerment, to use what Marcus had done not just as a story of trauma, but as a platform to educate and protect others. The following weeks fell into a strange new routine: waiting for court hearings, meeting periodically with Richard Brennan to update legal strategy, working with therapists, both individually and as a couple, to process the trauma and rebuild trust, not only between us, which remained strong, but in broader concepts like safety, family, and the ability to predict human behavior. Jessica developed temporary anxiety about technology, constantly checking her devices for signs of compromise, even knowing they were clean, a kind of digital PTSD. I developed hypervigilance, startled by unexpected noises, constantly checking security cameras, having difficulty fully relaxing even in our own home. These were the invisible scars Marcus had left, damage that would continue to affect us long after the legal process ended. 3 weeks after the bail hearing, on Tuesday, May 22nd, we returned to the courtroom for Marcus's formal appearance and defense presentation. This time the room was fuller. There were local journalists present because the case had gained media attention as an example of cyber stalking and digital privacy violation, increasingly relevant issues in Portland, a city with a strong technological culture. I saw Marcus brought in again, and he looked even worse than at the last hearing. He had visibly lost weight. His skin was pale and sickly from lack of sun, and there was an emptiness in his eyes that deeply disturbed me. My mother had updated me that he remained under mental health observation, receiving antidepressant medication and daily sessions with a prison psychologist. Judge Stevenson presided again, and her expression was as stern as before. Marcus had a new lawyer this time, no longer the young public defender, but an experienced criminal defense attorney named Robert Finch, whom my parents had apparently hired and paid against my protests. I had argued with them that Marcus didn't deserve good legal representation, but my father had been firm. He needs proper defense, not to escape justice, but to ensure that the process is fair and that he receives the mental help he needs. If he doesn't have competent representation, he will eventually use that as an excuse that he was treated unfairly. We want that when it's all over, there's no doubt that justice was properly served. It was sound logic, even if I hated to admit it. Robert Finch was a man in his 60s, with grey hair and an expensive navy blue suit that probably cost more than Marcus earned in a month when he was still employed. He had a reputation in Portland for being effective but ethical, not the type of lawyer who would use dirty tactics or try to victimize the victims. When his turn came to speak, he stood with calm authority and said something that genuinely surprised me. "Your Honor, after extensive consultation with my client and thorough review of the evidence in this case, Mr. Carter would like to plead guilty to all charges as presented." There was a murmur of surprise in the room. Plea agreements were common, but a full guilty plea without negotiation was relatively rare, especially so early in the process. Finch continued, "My client fully acknowledges the gravity and immorality of his actions. He offers no excuses and does not seek to minimize the tremendous harm he caused to the victims. However, we would like to present to the court significant context relating to Mr. Carter's mental health, which, while not justifying his actions, is relevant to sentencing. We have psychological evaluations conducted during his detention that diagnosed untreated mental health disorders, including major depression, narcissistic personality disorder with borderline traits, and pathological gambling addiction. We are requesting that the court consider, as part of sentencing, mandatory mental health treatment in addition to appropriate prison time. This was exactly what my mother had asked us to include, and I could see her in the gallery with her eyes closed in silent gratitude." Judge Stevenson turned directly to Marcus. "Mr. Carter, do you understand that by pleading guilty, you are waiving your right to a jury trial? Do you understand that you are admitting criminal responsibility for these offenses and that this will result in a criminal conviction and sentence that will include prison time?" Marcus stood slowly, supported by his lawyer's arm, and in a hoarse voice replied, "Yes, Your Honor, I understand. And I deserve whatever comes. What I did was inexcusable and sick, and I destroyed the lives of people who deserved nothing but respect and love from me. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I hope that someday, perhaps with proper treatment, I can understand why I became this person and ensure that I never hurt anyone in this way again." It was the first time I had heard Marcus take full responsibility without qualification or rationalization, and it was simultaneously satisfying and painful. Judge Stevenson accepted the guilty plea and scheduled a sentencing hearing for 6 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentencing reports to be prepared, including full mental health assessments and victim impact statements. She kept Marcus detained during this period, again denying bail. As he was escorted out, Marcus glanced briefly in our direction. This time there was no anger or despair in his eyes, only deep resignation and something that might have been genuine shame. I didn't return the gaze, simply held Jessica's hand, and we watched him disappear through the side door again. In the weeks following the guilty plea, Jessica and I began the difficult work of writing our victim impact statements. These would be read aloud at the sentencing hearing and considered by the judge in determining the appropriate sentence. Prosecutor David Chen guided us through the process, explaining that we should focus on the specific and personal impact Marcus' actions had had on our lives, both tangible and intangible. Jessica spent days working on her statement writing and rewriting, trying to capture the profound violation she felt upon discovering that her most intimate privacy had been invaded for 2 years. That conversations with her therapist about anxiety and insecurities had been read and used as weapons against her. My own statement was equally difficult to write. How do you articulate the betrayal of someone who shared your childhood, someone you defended in playground fights, someone you thought you knew completely? I wrote about the loss, not only of a brother, but of innocence, about family and loyalty, about how I now question judgments about people I think I know, about how I've developed hypervigilance and difficulty trusting even in unrelated contexts. I wrote about the financial costs of security measures, legal services and counseling, which totaled more than $35,000 so far. But mostly I wrote about the intangible cost of peace of mind, of the feeling of security in our own home, of the ability to simply exist without constantly looking over our shoulder. During those weeks, we also discovered through Richard Brennan that we weren't Marcus's only victims, at least not in the broadest sense. Private investigator Mike Sullivan had continued working on the case and discovered that Marcus had a history of similar obsessive behavior with at least 2 other women over the past 5 years. One was a former co-worker who had requested a transfer to another department after Marcus made her feel uncomfortable with unwanted attention and inappropriate comments. Another was an ex-girlfriend from about 4 years prior who had broken up with him after only 3 months because he had become controlling and possessive, checking her phone without permission and showing up uninvited at places where she was. None of these women had filed a formal complaint at the time. Both had simply walked away and moved on. But when Mike contacted them, explaining that Marcus was facing criminal charges for similar behavior, both agreed to provide written statements documenting their experiences. These statements were included in the pre-sentencing report as evidence of a pattern of behavior demonstrating that what Marcus did to us was not a one-time aberration, but an established pattern of disregard for boundaries and obsessive tendencies toward women he fixated on. This would be significant at sentencing, proving that he posed an ongoing risk and that serious intervention, including mandatory treatment, was necessary, not just punishment. 2 weeks before the sentencing hearing, something unexpected happened that complicated my feelings about the whole situation. I received a letter in the mail, sent from the Multnomah County Jail, with Marcus's familiar handwriting on the envelope. My first instinct was to throw it away unopened, but Jessica gently suggested that perhaps I should at least see what it said. Reluctantly, I opened the envelope and found 6 handwritten pages, the handwriting progressively more careless, as if it had been written over multiple sessions when he had the energy. The letter neither asked for forgiveness nor offered apologies. Instead, it was an attempt at explanation, Marcus trying to articulate to himself as much as to me how he had arrived at this point, an exercise clearly encouraged by his therapist in jail as part of taking responsibility. He wrote about growing up always feeling like he was second best, always compared to me, and falling short, always hearing about my accomplishments while his own were minimized or ignored. He wrote about how when he first met Jessica on my 31st birthday, something inside him broke when he saw that even in romance, I had found someone so clearly out of his league, so obviously better than any woman he could attract. He described how this envy had fermented into something toxic, how he had begun to convince himself that I didn't deserve my blessings, that somehow the universe had made a mistake and he deserved the life I had. And then, when his own circumstances began to crumble, debts piling up, relationships failing, he had found a focus for all that anger and resentment in the marriage between me and Jessica. Marcus wrote that initially he had convinced himself he was doing something noble, saving Jessica from a marriage he had persuaded himself wasn't good enough for her. But in retrospect, with the benefit of months of intensive therapy and without alcohol or gambling to numb him to the truth, he recognized that it had never really been about Jessica. She had been an object, a trophy, a symbol of everything he couldn't achieve through his own merit. His plan to insert himself into her life after destroying our marriage wasn't love, it was pathological obsession mixed with financial opportunism. He recognized that he was ill, that he needed extensive help, and that he would likely spend years working through the mental health issues that had allowed him to justify such horrific behavior. The letter ended simply, "I destroyed our family and my own life. You owe me nothing, not even forgiveness or acknowledgement of this letter. But I needed you to know that I am finally seeing clearly who I have become, and I am horrified. After reading the letter, I sat in silence for a long time. Jessica eventually joined me in the office where I had read it, and I handed her the letter without comment. She read carefully, her expressions subtly shifting as she processed the words. When she finished, she folded the letter back into the envelope and said, "Does this change anything for you?" I thought carefully before answering. It doesn't change what he did. It doesn't erase the trauma or make the consequences any less necessary, but perhaps it offers some context that makes the whole situation a little less inexplicable. I still haven't forgiven him. I don't know if I ever will. But at least now I understand that there was a sick person beneath the sick actions, not just a monster. Jessica nodded slowly. I don't know if it makes it better or worse. Both are hard to sit with. The week before the sentencing hearing, I received an unexpected visit at work. It was the psychologist who had been treating Marcus in prison, Dr. Alan Fisher, who had requested permission through Robert Finch to speak with me briefly. We met at a coffee shop near my office, and Dr. Fisher explained that he was doing something unorthodox, but felt necessary. He wanted me to know that Marcus was making genuine progress in therapy, finally confronting mental health issues that had likely gone untreated his entire adult life. This wasn't a plea for leniency, Dr. Fisher emphasized, but information I deserved to have as I considered how I felt about the case moving forward. Marcus will spend years in prison regardless, he said. But when he eventually gets out, what kind of person do you want him to be? Someone who spent years just hardening in anger and resentment, or someone who used the time to genuinely change and ensure he never repeats those patterns? It was a provocative question that I hadn't fully considered. My initial anger had been focused purely on punishment, on making Marcus suffer as he had made us suffer. But Dr. Fisher was right that punishment without rehabilitation only created more dangerous and broken people who eventually returned to society. If Marcus was going to spend 5 years in prison, wouldn't it be better for everyone if he came out of those 5 years fundamentally changed rather than fundamentally more bitter? This didn't mean forgiving or forgetting, but perhaps it meant supporting ongoing mental health treatment as a component of the sentence. I promised Dr. Fisher that I would consider his words when finalizing my victim impact statement. He thanked me, shook my hand, and left, leaving me with far more to think about than I had comfortably anticipated. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for Thursday morning, July 5th, ironically, the day after Independence Day. Jessica and I arrived at the courthouse at 8:30 a.m., both formally dressed, carrying our carefully revised printed impact statements. The room was fuller than at any previous hearing. In addition to local journalists, there were representatives from stalking victim advocacy organizations who had requested permission to observe the case as an example of how the justice system was finally beginning to take cybercrime and digital stalking seriously. My parents were there, seated across the room from us, a physical division that perfectly represented the impossible fracture in our family. Patricia and Rachel also attended, both to support us, but also to witness the closing of this horrific chapter. Marcus was brought in at 9 o'clock sharp, and he looked fundamentally different from any version of him I had seen before. He had gained some weight back, his beard was trimmed, and his eyes, though sad, had a clarity that hadn't been present at previous hearings. He wore civilian clothes provided by the family, grey dress pants and a white shirt, instead of the orange prison uniform, a courtesy permitted for sentencing hearings. As he entered, he glanced briefly at our parents, an almost imperceptible nod of recognition, but didn't look in our direction. Robert Finch stood beside him, organized and professional as always, carrying a thick briefcase with documentation to present to the court. Judge Stevenson entered at precisely 9:15, and the room immediately fell silent. She briefly reviewed the documents in front of her and then began the formal proceedings. We are here today for sentencing in the case of the State of Oregon versus Marcus Robert Carter. The defendant has pleaded guilty to all charges: unauthorized access to computer systems, first-degree stalking, harassment, second-degree trespassing, and violation of a restraining order. Before sentencing, we will hear impact statements from the victims and then presentations from the prosecutor and the defense. She looked at David Chen, the assistant district attorney. Would the state like to begin? David Chen stood and presented a powerful and concise summary of the case, emphasizing the premeditated and sustained nature of Marcus's crimes, the sophisticated use of technology to violate privacy, and the devastating impact on the victims. He argued for a sentence at the upper limit of the guidelines, 5 years in Oregon State Prison, with supervised probation for an additional 3 years after release. He also requested that Marcus be permanently registered in a cybercrime registry that Oregon had recently implemented, similar to sex offender registries, which would limit his future employment in certain fields and require him to inform future law enforcement agencies of his history. Your Honor, he concluded, this case represents exactly the type of predatory behavior that our laws were designed to punish. Mr. Carter used technology as a weapon to violate, manipulate, and terrorize. Society needs a clear message that such behavior results in severe consequences. Then came the time for our statements. Judge Stevenson first invited Jessica to approach the witness stand. Jessica walked with quiet dignity, carrying her paper, and as she began to read, her voice was strong but heavy with emotion. She described the 2 years of manipulation, the intrusion into her most private therapy sessions, the feeling of violation upon discovering that every aspect of her digital life had been monitored. She spoke of developing severe anxiety, of not being able to trust her own technology even months later, of the fear she felt when she realized Marcus had been in the backyard while she was alone inside. For 2 years, she said, her voice finally breaking slightly, I lived in a fabricated reality where I couldn't trust my own perceptions because someone was actively manipulating every piece of information I received. This isn't just a tech crime. It's psychological torture. When Jessica finished and returned to her seat, the room was completely silent. Then it was my turn. I stood, felt all eyes on me, and walked to the podium. My hands trembled slightly as I held my paper, and I had to pause for a moment to take a deep breath before beginning. I started by talking about growing up with Marcus, about being older brothers and protecting younger ones, about believing that family meant unconditional loyalty. Then I described the betrayal, not just what Marcus did, but what it represented in terms of the complete erosion of everything I thought family meant. I talked about the financial costs, the emotional costs, the cost in sleep and peace of mind. And then I added something that wasn't in the original draft, inspired by the conversation with Dr. Fisher the previous week. Your Honor, I said, looking directly at the judge, I want justice. I want Marcus to face real and significant consequences for what he did. But I also want him to receive help. We have found that he has untreated mental health issues that do not justify his actions, but help to explain them. If he simply goes to prison and comes out 5 years later as broken as when he went in, only older and more bitter, then we have done nothing to protect potential future victims. I ask that the sentence include mandatory mental health treatment, not as an alternative to prison time, but as an addition to it, that he use those years not only to repay his debt to society, but to fundamentally change the person he has become. I saw Marcus react visibly to my words, his shoulders trembling slightly, and I realized he was silently crying. After our statements, Robert Finch rose to present the defense's position. He did not attempt to minimize the crimes or plead for clemency based on sympathy. Instead, he presented comprehensive documentation of Marcus's mental health evaluations, progress reports from his treatment in prison, letters from Dr. Fisher and other professionals attesting to both the seriousness of his conditions and his genuine receptiveness to treatment. "Your Honor," Finch argued, "my client committed terrible crimes that deeply hurt innocent people. He deserves significant punishment and is accepting it without contest. But he also needs help. The evaluations show that he suffers from narcissistic personality disorder with borderline traits, untreated major depression, and gambling addiction. These are not excuses, they are explanations, and more importantly, they are treatable conditions." Finch continued, "We ask the court to consider sentencing that includes substantial prison time, as we believe it is appropriate and necessary, but also to order ongoing psychological treatment during incarceration and as a mandatory condition of parole upon release. The goal should not only be to punish, but also to rehabilitate, not just to remove an offender from society temporarily, but to ensure that when he returns, he is a fundamentally changed person who no longer poses a danger." He concluded by citing studies showing that recidivism rates are significantly lower when offenders receive appropriate mental health treatment in addition to mere incarceration. It was a compelling argument based on data and research, not just an emotional appeal. Finally, Marcus had the opportunity to speak for himself. Judge Stevenson asked if he would like to say anything before sentencing. Marcus stood slowly, leaning on the table in front of him, and turned to face not the judge, but Jessica and me directly. "There are no words," he began in a hoarse voice, "that can adequately express my shame and regret for what I did. I don't seek forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I don't offer excuses because there is no justification for my actions. For 2 years, I was a predator, a manipulator, a violator of the most fundamental trust and privacy. I used technology as a weapon against people who did nothing to me, but loved me like family." He paused, clearly struggling with emotion, tears now streaming freely. Marcus continued, "I am learning through therapy that I was ill in ways I didn't understand, but illness is no excuse. Many people suffer from mental health issues and don't torture their families. My choices were my own, regardless of underlying problems. I accept full responsibility and accept whatever punishment this court deems appropriate. My only hope is that I will be allowed to use the years I spend in prison to work on becoming a different person, so that when I eventually get out, I will no longer be the person who committed these horrific crimes." He then turned directly to Jessica. "You deserved respect, safety, and privacy. I gave you the opposite. I'm sorry isn't enough, but it's all I have to offer." And then to me, "Daniel, I destroyed our brotherhood in ways that can never be repaired. You were a better brother than I deserved, and I repaid you with betrayal. I will carry this shame for the rest of my life." The room was completely silent when Marcus sat down again. Even the journalists stopped taking notes, all simply absorbing the weight of the moment. Judge Stevenson spent several minutes silently reviewing documents, and I could see she was carefully considering all the factors presented. Finally, she raised her eyes and began to speak, and her words were measured and deliberate. "Mr. Carter," she began, "this is one of the most disturbing cases I have presided over in my career. The premeditated, sustained, and technologically sophisticated nature of your crimes demonstrates not impulsiveness, but a calculated campaign of psychological terrorism against your own family. The damage you have caused your victims is profound and lasting. They will never fully recover the innocence and peace of mind you have taken from them. However," the judge continued, "I also acknowledge that you have demonstrated genuine acceptance of responsibility in this process. You pleaded guilty without bargaining. You have seriously engaged in mental health treatment in detention. You have displayed remorse that appears authentic rather than performative. And significantly, the victims themselves, despite all the pain you have caused them, have asked that I consider mental health treatment as a component of your sentence. This speaks volumes about their character, not yours, but I still consider it important." She paused, letting the tension in the room build. "Therefore, it is this court sentence that you be sentenced to 4 years in the Oregon Correctional Institution, followed by 3 years of supervised probation with strict conditions." Judge Stevenson continued detailing the conditions. "During your incarceration, you will participate in weekly individual and group therapy focusing on personality disorders, addiction, and predatory behavior patterns. You will complete a gambling addiction treatment program. As a condition of your eventual release, you will continue mental health treatment for a minimum of 5 years, the frequency to be determined by your probation officer in consultation with mental health professionals. You will be registered in the Oregon Cybercrime Registry for 15 years. You are permanently prohibited from any contact with victims Daniel and Jessica Carter, including direct, indirect, or third-party contact. You may not possess or use monitoring devices, spyware software, or any surveillance technology. And finally, you will pay restitution to the victims totaling $38,400 to cover legal costs, security, and counseling. When the gavel fell, finalizing the sentence, I felt something inside me finally relax. It wasn't triumphant satisfaction, not joy at Marcus's destruction. It was simply profound relief that this was finally, officially, over. Jessica squeezed my hand so hard my fingers ached, and when I looked at her, I saw tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling slightly. Marcus accepted the sentence without visible reaction, simply nodding when the judge asked if he understood the terms. As guards came to escort him back, he looked one last time in our direction, a final look that carried the weight of years of shared history now irrevocably broken. Then he was led away, and the side door closed, with a finality that seemed to close an entire chapter of our lives. Outside the courthouse, we were approached by several journalists seeking comment. David Chen, our prosecutor, made a brief statement on our behalf about justice being served and the hope that the case would set an important precedent for future cyberstalking cases. We declined individual interviews, not wanting to prolong public attention more than necessary. My parents approached hesitantly, and there was an awkward moment where neither of us knew what to say. Finally, my mother simply hugged me, crying silently, and whispered, "Thank you for seeking treatment for him. I know it was difficult, but it gives hope that maybe someday he can be a better person." I returned the hug, but offered no false words of comfort. Some things are too broken for easy repairs. In the months following the sentencing, Jessica and I gradually began to rebuild normalcy in our lives. The security cameras remained, as did the hypervigilance, which slowly diminished but never completely disappeared. We continued therapy, both individual and couples, processing trauma in ways that were often 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Jessica eventually gave that cybersecurity talk at her company, and it was so well received that she began receiving invitations to speak at other organizations. She transformed her horrific experience into an advocacy platform, helping others recognize warning signs of digital stalking and protect their privacy. It was a way of reclaiming agency and meaning from a situation that could easily have left her as just a victim. I struggled more with emotional processing. Losing a brother to death would be devastating but definitive. Losing a brother to his own terrible choices, knowing he was alive somewhere in a prison cell, created complicated, ambiguous grief that had no clean closure. My therapist, an insightful woman named Dr. Sharon Williams, helped me understand that it was okay to grieve the loss of the relationship while still maintaining firm boundaries and holding Marcus accountable for his actions. Forgiveness wasn't mandatory for healing, she frequently reminded me. You can acknowledge that he was ill while still recognizing that he chose not to seek help until forced to. You can hope he will change while never allowing him back into your life. These aren't contradictions. They're nuances of complex situations. About 8 months after sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from Marcus again. This time I was emotionally prepared and chose to read it. It was shorter than the previous one, only 2 pages, and was an update on his progress in treatment. He wrote about confronting patterns he had repeated since adolescence, about finally understanding how envy and inadequacy had shaped his actions for decades. He mentioned that he had begun making amends to the 12-step program, not with the intention of contacting victims, which he knew was inappropriate and would violate the restraining order, but through therapeutic letters that would never be sent, working through accountability and behavioral change. He didn't ask for a response and specified that he didn't expect one. He was simply keeping his promise to work on changing. I didn't reply, but kept the letter, a silent acknowledgement that growth was possible even for people who had caused tremendous harm. Jessica and I also made a significant decision about a year after the sentencing. We decided to sell our house, the one where so much horror had unfolded, where Marcus had jumped the fence and tried to break in. As much as we had worked to reclaim it as our safe space, it would always carry memories we preferred to leave behind. We bought a new house in a different neighborhood in Portland, a fresh start in a space that was entirely ours without any tainted history. The move was cathartic, physically packing up the past and unpacking into a new place that represented a future without shadows of Marcus' betrayal looming over every room. We performed small rituals as we moved. Jessica suggested we burn copies of all the manipulative text messages in a symbolic bonfire in the backyard of the old house before handing it over to the new owners. We watched paper burn and turn to ashes, and it felt like releasing something we had carried for a long time. As for the extended family, the fracture never fully healed, but found a new balance. Patricia and I remained close, perhaps even closer than before, because the shared experience of processing Marcus's betrayal brought us together. My parents struggled more, my mother especially carrying guilt about her upbringing and wondering where she had failed. Eventually, she too began therapy, working through her own guilt and grief. My father coped by suppressing emotions and focusing on practicalities, his usual way of dealing with things. We had occasional family dinners, but there was always an empty seat at the table, a presence of absence that everyone noticed, but no one mentioned. It was the new normal, functional but permanently altered. 3 years after the original sentencing, I received notification from the Oregon Department of Corrections that Marcus would be eligible for a parole hearing in 6 months. Under Oregon sentencing, non-violent prisoners who demonstrated exemplary behavior and completed mandatory programs could be considered for early release after serving 75% of their sentences. Marcus had apparently done exactly what was asked of him, consistently attended therapy, completed treatment programs, and maintained a clean disciplinary record. The notification included information about my right as a victim to submit a statement to the parole board and attend the hearing if I wished. Jessica and I discussed at length whether we should participate in the process or simply let it proceed without our input. Eventually, we decided to submit written statements, but not appear in person. Our statements acknowledged that Marcus had apparently made work to change, which was positive, but emphasized that the permanent restraining order should continue indefinitely, that he should have strict probation conditions, including ongoing mental health treatment and a ban on certain technologies, and that any violation of terms should result in immediate re-incarceration. We did not object to release in principle if the committee determined he was no longer a danger, but we made it clear that rebuilding any kind of family relationship was not on the table now or in the foreseeable future. Some boundaries, once violated so completely, could not be restored no matter how much time passed or how much work was done. The parole hearing took place without our presence, but we received notification after the decision. Marcus had been granted supervised parole, with extensive conditions, exactly as we had requested. He would be released to a transitional housing program in Salem, Oregon, 47 miles from Portland, far enough away to minimize the chance of accidental encounters. He was prohibited from entering Multnomah County except for pre-approved medical appointments or mandatory legal meetings. He could not possess smartphones or internet-enabled computers without monitoring by software supervised by his parole officer. He was to attend therapy twice a week and weekly game support meetings. He could not work in any field involving access to clients' personal information. And critically, the standing restraining order against contact with us remained in full effect. The day Marcus was released from prison, Jessica and I stayed home, doors locked, security systems activated, both taking the day off work just in case. Logically, we knew he was legally prohibited from contacting us and that a violation would result in immediate return to prison. But emotionally, knowing he was free again in the world, no longer confined behind bars, brought back anxiety we had spent years working to lessen. The day passed without incident. No attempts at contact, no appearances, nothing. Eventually, life went on. Weeks turned into months, and gradually the hypervigilance about his release diminished back to the cautious baseline that had become our normal. We continued living our lives, building careers, strengthening our relationship, planning for an eventual future with children in the new, safe home we had created. Now, 5 years after it all began, when I look back on the whole saga, I have mixed feelings. Part of me wishes we could have resolved everything differently, that the family could have remained intact, that Marcus could have sought help before it got to the point of causing so much harm. But I recognize that these are fantasies, not realities. Marcus made conscious and sustained choices over 2 years. We simply exposed the truth and sought justice. What happened afterward was a direct result of his actions, not our reactions. And while it was incredibly difficult, painful, and transformative in ways I never anticipated, it also taught us valuable lessons about boundaries, about the value of documentation and evidence, about the importance of taking threats seriously, even when they come from family. Jessica often reflects that what Marcus intended as the destruction of our marriage, ironically, strengthened it. Facing crisis together, working as a team to expose him and navigate the legal system, supporting each other through trauma and recovery, all served to demonstrate that our relationship was fundamentally solid in ways he could never have undermined, no matter how much time or effort he invested. We learned that we can trust each other completely, even when trust in others has been violated. We learned that we can face terrible things together and come out the other side still committed to our shared future. And we learned that sometimes love means vigorously protecting what we have built, setting hard boundaries against those who would threaten it, even when those threateners share our DNA. As for what Marcus is doing now, I don't know the details, and I actively choose not to seek information. I heard through my mother, who maintains limited contact with him against my advice, but it's her choice as an adult that he's working in a warehouse in Salem, living modestly, continuing therapy, apparently trying to build a quiet and discreet life. She says he's changed, that treatment has made a real difference, that he carries visible remorse. I don't dispute her assessment, but I also don't feel compelled to check personally. Some bridges, once burned, don't need to be rebuilt. I can hope from a distance that he has genuinely changed and will never hurt another person the way he hurt us, while simultaneously maintaining that he will no longer have a role in my life. These two things can coexist. This story doesn't have a perfectly happy ending because real life rarely does. We haven't reconciled with Marcus. Family is permanently altered. We still carry psychological scars that will likely never completely disappear. But we survived. We grew. We built a good and meaningful life despite everything that was done to destroy it. And perhaps that is its own kind of victory. Marcus tried to break our marriage through lies, manipulation, and violation. Instead, he strengthened us, taught us our own worth, and showed us exactly what we are capable of facing together. If there's a lesson in all of this, it's that the destructiveness of others doesn't have to define us. We have a choice in how we respond, how we heal, and how we move forward. And we choose to move forward together, stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to protecting and nurturing what we have built. So if you're listening to me from wherever you're watching from, and you're facing family betrayal, stalking, manipulation, or any form of abuse from someone who supposedly loves you, I want you to know a few things. First, it's not your fault. No matter what the abuser says, no matter how they try to justify or rationalize it, their behavior is their choice. Second, you deserve safety, privacy, and respect, non-negotiable. Third, documentation is crucial. Keep everything, record everything, build a case before confronting. Fourth, the legal system can be slow and frustrating, but it can work if you have solid evidence and persistent advocacy. Fifth, therapy is not a luxury, it's a necessity to process complex trauma like this. Sixth, you don't have to forgive to move on. And finally, seventh, you are stronger than you think, capable of facing more than you imagine, and you deserve a life free from fear and manipulation. The last thing I would say is this. Revenge doesn't have to be destructive and chaotic. The most powerful revenge is simply ensuring that truth is known, that justice is served, and that you build a life so good, so strong, so unbreakably your own, that their attempt to destroy it becomes just a footnote in your story, not the defining chapter. Marcus tried to destroy us for 2 years. We exposed him in one night and spent years building something better from the rubble. That's real victory. That's real revenge. And that's a life he can never take from us again.